Hi guys, back again here. This is now the second part of my Test 10 review for a student friend of mine over at the sub at Reddit for the SAT Blackout S17. I reviewed Practice Test 10, a number of reading passages and problems, and the student did well, only got 2 wrong per passage, which is great. That leaves room for improvement, but also um, you want to reduce that to getting no wrong on at least a couple of them. That gives you space to make a mistake, which may or may not happen to you. Would that we all got a perfect score, but hey, we're doing the best we can, and we're always looking for improvement. So that's what's awesome, and I love giving feedback to help kids figure out, well, how did I make a mistake? How could I apply what Michael shows me into the next session? So I focus on the preview strategy for the reading, and I really hope that you can try and embrace that. You don't have to do it the exact way I do, but it makes no sense not to look at the questions before you fully read the passage. Now, right now, I'm going to do the writing. Student got 4 wrong, so let's move into the tablet and go over it. Again, this is practice test 10. We're in the writing section here. The writing section, we're looking to revise improved expression of ideas, so that's usage, and we're looking for editing to correct errors in sentence structure, usage, or punctuation. So there are some key ideas which we'll go over here about what that means, but students going to start with writing number 14. So just before we get going, I want to point out a couple things on this first passage. A title is always super helpful. On this one, on test 10, the first passage, assuming you know what a cat in a hat is, you can use this to answer at least 2, maybe 3 questions just based upon the title. Never forget the title. Take a minute, stop, consider, what's the title tell me? Because we don't get a little introduction up here like we do in the reading section. We don't know the context. Now, as opposed to the reading, where I don't want you to preview the possible answers, on the writing, I want you to preview the possible answers. Wherever possible, read over the first one into the A here. So this would be, and by the way, pay attention to punctuation. That is or is not underlined, so it's just and. So I like to put it there. That helps me not get confused, because when I read this, that's prejudicing my mind towards A because I'm reading it the way A is. Now, that can be good too, because if A is blatantly wrong, you feel it. And but with this test, I want you to be able to identify the rule. Why is I'll just show you real quick how this answers a couple questions. So how a cat in a hat, in other words, a book for kids, an illustration book for kids, changed children's education. If you look at this one where the writer wants to include a quotation by Hersey that supports the topic of the passage, interesting an individual sense of wholeness, he probably said that, right? But the cat in the hat isn't about a sense of wholeness. So eliminate it. I don't need to read this to know that. Learning starts with failure. No, cat in a hat is just a goofball cat that wears a hat. Cats don't wear hats anyway, but whatever. It's teaching kids to learn to read. It's not about journalism. So drawings like those are wonderfully imaginative genius among children's illustrators. So that's what we got there. That's pretty easy, but it helps you avoid that mistake by thinking about the title. And you look on this one, the last question is usually a main point question or a concluding sentence question, which means that the title is going to be important. How a cat in the hat changed education. It's not about limited vocabulary and appealing choices, so A is wrong. It's not about the worldwide sales, as impressive as they were. It's about the enduring ability to delight children and engage them in learning how to read. How a cat in a hat changed children's education. And it's not about the history of illustration. So the easy ways to not make mistakes on some of those questions by paying attention to the title. Now, in the 4 that our friend Blackout S17 got wrong, let's see if the titles would help us at all. So we're starting on this one. Keep student volunteering voluntary. So this is obviously something that is promoting the idea that volunteering for students should be voluntary. I guess not compulsory. In other words, not forced. Makes sense. Okay, cool. We're looking at number 14 first. I like this one because it gives us a couple really cool lessons on it. So when I look at these, I want to see how are they similar, how are they distinct. I'm not going to rewrite this whole thing, but I see that I got a possessive after the S, and I got a possessive after the S here, so officials are. Now, possessive nouns possess nouns, right? So sometimes we use a noun to describe the type of thing the other noun is. So if I have the word food here, I can just say, well, I want to describe food for dogs, right? So food for dogs. Well, I just say dog food. Notice there's no punctuation separating them because this is acting like an adjective. We don't separate adjectives from nouns with a comma. No, they're not separated. So we have dog food, but I have two nouns. So that's called an attributive or a positive noun. With grammar, there are tons of different rules here. But the thing about this, notice how I can't say dog's food because since it's an adjective, it's acting as an adjective, it's in the singular. So I have here now, I look at this, I can eliminate this one because student's choice. I could have student choice, but instead I have student choice, which means that that noun, this is a noun, this is a noun, is not acting as an adjective because it's in the plural. So I can eliminate B. Now all I have to do is decide, is it apostrophe S or S apostrophe? This would be the singular, and this would be the plural form. So I have to match it to officials are taking away students. Should I have students or student? By requiring students, this is called parallel construction. Parallel, so I want, if I start talking about students, I need to maintain talking about students. So I use the plural students choice on number 14 there. Hope that makes sense. I love the opportunity to teach this notion of a noun possessing a noun and a noun operating as an adjective. We can see how we use that to eliminate B here, which something might otherwise be confusing. Alrighty, moving on to number. So we're going to go down to number 17 here. All right, number 17. This is a tricky one if you're not familiar with it. So let's just get familiarized with it and see what's going on. So effect and affect. They sound the same kind of, but they're used a little bit differently. The easiest way, without getting into this too deeply, with the difference between affect and effect, these are both verbs. There's a subtle difference between them, not so subtle actually, because they are different, but for the SAT purpose, I just want you to think of the word effect with an E as a noun and affect as a verb. As verbs, they both are. You'll notice if you look it up in the dictionary that the first definition for effect is a noun, the second one is a verb, where it's used less frequently. The verb to effect means to bring about an action happening, a change happening, whereas affect is making an impact upon something. So we affect the outcome, we effect something to happen, but we're going to think in terms of the SAT as a noun and affect as a verb. So when I see these things, effect and affect, the first thing I do is say, what do we have here? Is this a adjectives, noun, verb, pronoun, and thus effect? So, and I have let's tear the sentence apart. Some studies have also found that students who do community service are more likely to volunteer as adults, and thus, that word thus is repeating basically as a pronoun. It's operating as, it's a conjunction sort of. Thus is an interesting word, but for our purposes here, we're talking about, well, what is it doing? It's basically conjoining these two. That's why we have a comma here saying, and let's read it rather than having thus. So some studies have also found that students who do community service are more likely to volunteer as adults, and students who do community service, thus, thereby, will have an effect upon or will affect society positively. So it's not to have an effect, it's to affect. So this is a verb indeed. Now, if it's a verb, I can think about, well, what verb form would it be? I've got to volunteer and effect, so I can get rid of affecting. I could say thus affecting, but the problem is I got this and here. So we're going to say likely to volunteer as adults, comma, thus affecting, which wouldn't work because it's the wrong form of the word. So what they oftentimes do this, they give you a possible form that would work with the wrong case or something just like that. That a positive noun we were looking at before, they made it plural, so it couldn't be a noun modifying a noun because it has to be a singular. So if we're affecting, thus affecting, which would be fine, but it's not because it's thus affecting, because we need to use this as a verb here, comma, and thus, and we're skipping this is essentially students who do community service affect society positively over the many course of years. So we go with B here. Now, what's the difference between affect and affect? We're getting rid of the effect, right? Because we got rid of the two forms, the E, because we're using this as a verb, not as a noun. So we go with affect. So we're now all we have to decide is it singular, plural? So I affect, he affects, she affects, they affect, students affect. B there. Hope you see that where that came from. And that's just a flat out rule. They're not going to use the E effect as a verb on this test. Number 17, 20, and 31. We got one more on this passage. So this passage kind of threw the students. So I hope that doesn't happen again. Blackout S17. So number 20 here. Long sentence, of course. Let's see what's going on. Than the service hours of those. Than did students who were. Than hours worked by students compared with students. Normally we would go for the simplest, the most direct statement, which would seem to be compared, right? Let's do the sentence. She found that students who were required to volunteer rushed to complete their service hours in early high school. Comma. Now we fix this. This needs to be, I think number 19 needs to be, let's see, 19. They then, let's go with they then, because that makes more sense. They then did significantly less regular volunteer work in the 12th grade compared with students not required to volunteer. Okay, one of the problems here is that this is the shortest one, but when we have comparisons, we need to maintain parallel structure of the comparison. So then work in the 12th grade compared, we're not being given what it's compared with. They did significantly less regular volunteer work in the 12th grade than did the students. See, we got that they did. We got to maintain that did here. Then did the students. So we're going to go with B, but let's eliminate the others. In the 12th grade, then the service work. Here we're comparing service hours to they who did the action, which is the students. So service hours, we get rid of A. Then hour, and again, C has the same problem because we're comparing students with hours as opposed to students. So between these two, B and D, we have to go with B because we have they then did students who were. When we have that comparison, so we have the did here, we need to maintain the did here. Next up is number 31. So we have another passage we're dealing with, which is marsupials lend a hand to science. And you got the dog barking there. Oh no, this is yes, this is on okay. Main claim of the passage. Let's see if the title helps us. Marsupials lend a hand, so that's toying around with the title like they like to do. So in other words, science studying marsupial handism helps science in general. So I guess is that the main point of this whole thing is we're talking about how scientists benefit from studying this stuff. We have down here the last one. Now the student got number 33 right. We might want to consider when we talk about the main claim of the passage, because we're going to get a main claim at the end here. So when I see this main claim and then I see this here, the writer wants to conclude the passage, which would be making the main point. I want to make sure I'm getting this straight. So the student did this one correctly. 33, the answer is, let's see, as does the mechanisms by which in the absence of corpus callosum, the hemispheres of the marsupial brain communicate. The majority of humans preferring their right remains a mystery, though researchers should not neglect the sizable minority. No, we're not talking about that. Scientists who believe that studies like this one may someday yield insights to the causes. Certain, no, they're not talking about neurological disorders. And an additional study is planned to study handless animals that stand upright. This is about marsupials, and only some of the time, so that makes no sense. So we have to kind of go with A, and let's see if we can make sense of that. Eliminating down to A here. I do that purely through elimination here, without really thinking about this one too much. Why the majority of marsupial study prefer their left forelimbs, while the majority of humans prefer the right, remains a mystery. However, as does the mechanism by which, in the absence of whatever, as does the mechanism by which the hemispheres of the marsupial brain communicate. So we're talking about, they're trying to understand the way the hemispheres of the brain of marsupials communicate. So let's see if that informs us on 31. Kangaroos, though, still do not exhibit handedness to the extent that humans do. Okay, I'm not sure that really tells us about what's going on in this passage. So I'm gonna take a slight pause on A, no change. Okay, so we're taking a soft pass on A, though do not exhibit handedness to the extent that humans do. And I'm not sure if that's true or not without having reread the passage, but let's look at B. For marsupials in the study of them, handedness seems to be associated with bipedalism. Well, there's something about the comparison between humans and marsupials, and the idea is, I guess, now they talked about it down here, talking about animals that stand upright only some of the time. So this tells us that the study is about animals that stand up, usually stand upright. That would be bipedalism. If I read the passage, I would probably pick that up. So I can't eliminate that here because it might be that the distinction, that's why humans and marsupials are the same, they're bipedal, yet they have a difference that they're studying here, left-right preference of the brain. There are many things scientists do not understand about. No, it's not that. We're not the main claim. Additional studies in this phenomenon will need to be performed with other mammals. No, they're not. That's not what the main point is, right? They're not. They're just saying they do suggest that there are things we still don't understand, but it's not calling for these things. The whole point of this thing is that studying marsupials helps understand handiness. So we got to go with B. Hope that makes sense. Okay. Well, that was hopefully a quick review for you, and I don't have too many takeaways because I don't see a pattern in the wrong answers here, but I do see these wrong answers. One, affect, you may not know. Perhaps maybe number 31, really kind of dealing with the main claim of the passage, doing that elimination, that might suggest something about, I believe it was number 20. Well, let's see, 20 was... 20 was the comparison, so that's disassociated with it as well. And then we had number 14, which was using the possessive form of a noun, possessing a noun. So there's no pattern here. If you'd gotten more wrong, we might see a pattern. What's really more striking here is probably look at the pattern of all the things you got right there on Blackout S17. That's really great. So you're identifying the rules. One thing I would say is if there's a right answer you got on any of the other questions that you don't really know why, definitely figure that out. Look for the rule and eliminate. That's how we did on 14. On 17, we're just going to follow this pattern here that we're treated as a verb, and then make sure we identify that as a verb. That's a rule there for you. And then the other two, number 20, which was the comparison, that's a rule to pay attention to. And a comparison, if we need to compare what they did to what the others did, we have to say did, so we're repeating that. And they have this in a couple different forms on some of the other tests. I think some of the newer tests, practice tests 9 and 8, do this as well, so pay attention to those. And then on 31 was really just kind of a main point type question. I don't know that title helps us too much, but it does give us idea that it's about studying, as the correct answer on the main point question said, that marsupials in the study, handiness seems to be associated with bipedalism. So that's the point of the study, studying why humans and that kind of thing. I don't know, that's kind of a tricky question there, but good job on it. I think you got to just trust the elimination on some of those things. Whereas if the title doesn't help us, then we just got to do a really strong elimination here. Okay, good luck.